Now I'd like to invite the moderator of this workshop, Mr. Wonho Kim, Dean and Professor at the Graduate School of International Studies, Hankuk University of Foreign Studies, to take the floor.
Good morning, East Asia, and good afternoon, Buenas tardes, Latin America. East Asia and Latin America are geographically pretty distant regions from each other, but the good news is digital economy has made us closer. I think even beyond the COVID-19 crisis, we can use this format, webinar, as soon as possible. Today we have 5 presenters on 4 topics, and each presenter will be assigned about 15 minutes. And in the second session, 2 presenters will make presentation alternately. So after all the presentation, we are going to take questions coming up in the chatting window. So again, please let me remind that please refrain from private chatting, personal chatting on the window, and please make sure you mention to whom your question is to be addressed. Okay, then now let us start. The first presentation by Mr. Abdul Abiad, Director of Macroeconomic Research of Asian Development Bank, on the topic of lockdown, loosening, and prospects for recovery. Please, Mr. Abiad.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you to FEALAC for the invitation to speak to you, and good evening as well to those in Latin America. I will be talking this morning about lockdown, loosening, and prospects for recovery, both in the global economy and on developing Asia, which is obviously the focus of the Asian Development Bank. So let me start by giving an overview of the forces that are shaping both the downturn and the recovery from this pandemic. So just as a scene setter, let's look at where we stand in terms of the global outbreak. As of end July, global COVID cases stood at about 17 million. And currently, as of yesterday, we've exceeded 20 million. And so you can see that on the left-hand side of the chart. You can see the distribution as well. The Americas make up just over half of total global cases, with the United States shown in red, accounting for about 5 million of the cases, and Latin America accounting for about 5.5 million. The right-hand side chart shows basically the new daily cases globally, and we're seeing about more than 200,000 cases globally at the current point. If I zoom into developing Asia, and so just for everybody's information, developing Asia for the Asian Development Bank consists of 46 developing member countries, but given that FEALAC just covers East Asia and Southeast Asia, I will focus my discussions on those 2 sub-regions. So here's what the outbreak looks like right now in developing Asia. Close to 3 million cases across our developing member countries. And as you can see in the charts, even though the outbreak started in East Asia, which is shown in blue, cases there have stabilized. There you can hardly see the new cases, and so really the epicenter of the pandemic has shifted to South Asia in particular. I won't spend too much time on that, but India, Bangladesh, Pakistan are having difficulties now with their outbreaks. But it's also the case that in Southeast Asia and Central Asia, you are also seeing countries trying to get a grip on their domestic outbreaks. As a result of these outbreaks, what's happened in the region is that, as you know, many governments have been imposing containment measures, and these have varied both in terms of their stringency and their duration. And so the chart on the left is basically an indicator of containment stringency from Oxford. And what it is it's a composite of 9 different indicators, which cover school closures, workplace closures, and travel restrictions. It's on a scale of 0 to 100, and darker bars indicate more stringent containment measures or lockdowns. And so what you can see, this goes from January 1 up to end July. And what you can see is that in many countries, lockdowns started in mid to late April and were pretty tight. And then what you then see is that there's been loosening in many countries. The other thing to note is the difference in intensity of these lockdowns. So South Asia and Central Asia. So South Asia are the countries in the middle band, and Central Asia at the top band, all have had the most stringent containment measures in developing Asia. East Asia, which is of interest to FEALAC, which is the second group of countries, has had relatively less stringent measures. And then Southeast Asia is the fourth band, or the second from the bottom. And there again, it's also less than in South Asia and Central Asia, but more than in East Asia. And also, I guess, to emphasize also, there's substantial heterogeneity within these subregions. So countries like the Philippines have had more stringent lockdowns than in other countries. These lockdowns or these containment measures have had an impact on mobility, which we can see on the chart in the right. The intensity of the lockdown or the stringency is plotted on the x-axis, and the decline in mobility as measured by Google Mobility. So this is mobility outside the residence is measured on the y-axis, and it's relative to a baseline period in January to February. And so what you can see there is that, well, first, that there's a strong negative relationship. The more stringent the lockdowns, not surprisingly, the greater the decrease in mobility outside the home. You can also see differences in sub-region more clearly here. You can see East Asian countries in the top right, in the top left corner, the orange squares. So where there's been less stringent lockdown and also less reduction in mobility. You can ignore Mongolia because the baseline in Mongolia was in the deep of winter where temperatures were minus 25 centigrade. So that's why relative to that baseline, there's an increase in mobility. And then you see South Asia and Central Asia at the bottom right, and then you see Southeast Asia sort of in the middle. But as I said, there's substantial variation. So you see that the Philippines had one of the most stringent lockdowns and also one of the largest declines in mobility. And what that has meant is that we've shown in analysis, and it's not surprising, that both stringency of lockdowns and reduced mobility are correlated with economic activity. This is data from Q1. So if you just look at, and for a global sample, so if you just look at the stringency of lockdowns on the left chart or the declines in mobility on the right chart, and look at how that's related to the declines in GDP growth in Q1, you see sort of that negative relationship, more stringent lockdowns, more negative decline, more negative decline in GDP growth, and similarly, a bigger decline in average mobility. You also see a bigger decline in GDP growth. Q2 data has only started coming out in the last week or two. So far, for the countries we've seen, this relationship still continues to hold. This chart basically just gives us a quantification of how big those effects are. So roughly speaking, a 10-point increase in stringency on a 0 to 100 scale, or a 10% decline in 10 percentage point decline in mobility, or a doubling of cases per million. If you're comparing two countries and one country has twice as many cases per million, it's associated with roughly 0.5, 0.6 percentage points decline in consumption growth, and about 1 to 1.2 percentage points decline in investment growth. So that's one. The point here is that lockdowns and reduced mobility are perhaps one of the primary channels through which economic activity and domestic demand are affected. Now, in addition to domestic demand, we also know it's going to be tough to recover because the global environment is particularly weak. So the point I just want to make here, these are our forecasts in our June Asian Development Outlook supplement for the major advanced economies. And so the G3 are set for substantial contractions, about 5.5% in the US, 7% in the Euro area, and about 5% in Japan. The Q2 numbers were particularly large, so we will be revisiting these forecasts. But so it's a very tough environment for countries, even looking beyond their having to deal with domestic outbreaks. One very stark picture of this external shock is tourism. So we are in the midst of a global tourism collapse. The chart on the left shows a year-on-year growth in tourism arrivals for countries in our region, which have data to May, June, or July. And basically what you're seeing is that all countries are seeing declines of anywhere between 90 to 100% in terms of tourism arrivals, which isn't surprising. You have travel bans, you have precautionary behavior, your incomes have taken a hit. And the chart on the right basically tells us that we shouldn't expect a rapid recovery in this even after travel bans are lifted. So those bars basically are the responses to an IATA survey of passengers asking them, how soon after travel bans are lifted will you travel? Only 12% said they would travel immediately. 33% said they would wait a month or two. And the majority, 55%, if you add the gray bars, the three gray bars on the right, basically said they would wait either 6 months or a year or more, or they've put off travel indefinitely. So even if travel bans are lifted, it's unlikely that travel and tourism will recover quickly. So the prospects for 2021 are not that good. One of the analysis that ADB has done was to look at the impact of COVID-19, both globally and on the developing Asia region. So this appeared in a CEPR ebook in late June. And basically what we found was that COVID-19, the pandemic will result in a loss of between 6 to 9 trillion, depending on the scenario, of global GDP relative to a no-COVID baseline. So that's roughly 7 to 10.5% of global GDP. And so one way to interpret this, if you think that most of this is falling on 2020, is that if growth was going to be about 3% in 2020 in the absence of COVID, this would imply a contraction of between 4 to 7.5% this year in global GDP. So how do we see the prospects in developing Asia as a result of this? Our forecasts as of June were that developing Asia will see its lowest growth in 6 decades. Our forecast was of barely positive growth, 0.1%. And that's if you include the newly industrialized economies. If you exclude them, it'll be slightly higher. It's obviously a downward revision even relative to our April forecasts, and it's more than 5 percentage points lower than our pre-COVID pre-COVID growth. We do expect growth to bounce back to about 6% next year, but as the chart on the right shows, that growth rate is not enough to get us back to the pre-crisis trend, which is the dashed black line. So the orange line is basically what happens when you translate the growth rates into levels, and you see that there's still going to be a gap left, and we don't think so that, in other words, the gap will be closed only gradually. It will not be a V-shaped recovery. And so here's a visual representation of our forecasts for individual countries in developing Asia. As I said earlier, East Asia accounts for about 70%, and Southeast Asia about 15% of developing Asia. So FEALAC countries account for about 85% of GDP, of regional GDP here. So 3 things to take away from this. The first is that no country has been spared. What's being plotted here is GDP growth on the x-axis, our current forecast for this year. And on the y-axis, we're plotting revisions relative to our pre-COVID forecasts in December. And so the first thing to note is that all dots are below the x-axis. In other words, all countries have seen downward revisions. The second point to take away is that most countries are actually expected to contract. So 35 of our 46 member countries are to the left of the x-axis. So we're forecasting an outright contraction this year. And the third takeaway is that the only reason we're still forecasting positive growth for developing Asia as a whole is because China, which is that large circle on the right, is still expected to grow by 1.8% this year. It managed to contain its own outbreak relatively quickly, and Q2 numbers were indicated that normalization had really picked up. So let me end my presentation there, and I look forward to the Q&A and discussion later. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abdul Abiad. Dr. Abiad wanted to emphasize the seriousness of the impact from COVID-19 in East Asia. And particularly, he presented the degree of impact. Generally speaking, developing Asia is expected to suffer about minus 5.7% to 8.5%, depending on the length of the period of impact. But on the other hand, he was quite optimistic about the prospect, taking East Asia as, again, the engine of growth for the global economy.